evening. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to welcome you tonight to this public discussion on the emergence of complexity and evolution. And these questions span many fields from biology to computation and are central to making progress in this field. This evening we are very fortunate to have with us some of the greatest minds in evolutionary biology, development, and genetics. And they really need no introduction, but let me just say that besides their pioneering research and influential books in these areas, they have also influenced and shaped many of the ideas in other fields, including our own. So let me hand over the mic to Peter Bentley, who will be leading this discussion. But before that, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Well, thank you very much, Hod. So welcome to the Natural History Museum. I hope you enjoy the surroundings. It's not often we get to sit amongst, well, I guess underneath the tail of a dinosaur. But luckily it's past its ability to do anything smelly. Just before we start, this is, for those of you who don't know, this is following the BBC Question Time format, which means we have pre-chosen questions. I will be asking certain people to stand up, who we've chosen already. They will read out their question when we get a microphone to them, and I will put the question to the panel, and we'll hear what they have to say. The GECCO organisers would like to start with a kind of warm-up question for the panel. It's an easy one, guys. So, the question is this: could the panel briefly explain what led them to choose their specific area of scientific study? What is it about the subject that inspires, excites, and fascinates them? Richard Dawkins.
I was an undergraduate at Oxford, and at Oxford we have the tutorial system where you have, in those days at least, one-to-one tutorials. And I had thought that I was going to do biochemistry, but then I had half a term of tutorials with Nico Tinbergen, who was the great scholar of animal behavior at Oxford. And that really switched me completely. And I, after just these 4 tutorials, I asked if I could join him and become a member of the animal behavior research group. His style of tutoring was totally different from anybody else. The normal style was to give a reading list on some topic, which would be a set of original papers, and you go into the library and read them up. Tinbergen's style was to give me one DPhil thesis, one PhD thesis, usually a recent thesis of one of his own students. And I had to act as an undergraduate as a sort of examiner of this PhD DPhil thesis. So I had to write an essay about the theoretical background to it, about the methods used, criticizing it, making suggestions for what should be done next. And it was a wonderful, heady experience for an undergraduate to be invited to pit my wits against my betters in this way. And I loved that style of teaching, and he was a wonderful man to just have an argument with and have a discussion with. And I said I thought I wanted to get into this kind of subject where there were real issues to debate, things to argue about, controversies, not just learning a lot of facts. I never was any good at learning facts. And so that's what led me into animal behavior. And then after I was in animal behavior for about 10 years, a bit longer, 15, I then wrote a book about evolution, which was called The Selfish Gene. And that rather switched me again into a different field, a somewhat different field. And ever since then I've been driven by writing books, mostly for a lay audience. As to what excites me about it, well, it's true, it's there. It is, evolution at least, is the answer to the most profound questions of the existence of life. We now are getting close to understanding why we exist, what it's all about, what the world is all about, why life is here, what the rationale for life is. What could be more thrilling and exciting than that?
Thank you, Richard. Steve Jones.
I think my response is less poetic than that. However, it's just as ecclesiastical, given the echoes in this hall. I feel as if I'm preaching to an audience here. It's very mundane. I left school, actually started working as an engineer. Decided that was a bad idea, and got into the only university that would let me in, which is the University of Edinburgh. My tutor used to work on the genetics of snails, and he sent me an essay to write, which I still haven't finished. And in fact, this very day, I was up working on the Marlborough Downs in southern England in some of the classic snail sites, so I'm still doing it. Many of my colleagues at that time, we're talking about the 60s, at the beginnings of molecular biology, went on to make enormous names for themselves. You won't know them in your field, many of you, but somebody called Ed Southern was a contemporary of mine who really is now professor of biochemistry at Oxford and revolutionized the technology of molecular biology. Paul Nurse was also roughly a contemporary of mine. He won the Nobel Prize a couple of years, 2 or 3 years ago now, for looking at the control of the cell cycle, genetics of that. There isn't a Nobel Prize in snail genetics, unfortunately. What I very quickly discovered, though, that if you did my kind of biology, which was then field biology, you got a cheap tan very quickly. And I'm a man and I counted it up today, actually, I'm a man who spent 4 years in a tent. And by that I mean literally 1,400 nights under canvas. And I still do that. And that rather trivial reason is one reason why I started in evolutionary biology. And that's an honest but not very exciting answer. But having said that, I agree absolutely with Richard. Evolution to me has always been, biology is always, to me, it's a bit like a language. It's the language of life. And evolution is its grammar. It's the structure of biology. And it's all very well and good to be a great expert on pollination, let's say, or a certain kind of fossil. But actually, by doing that, you're adding a little bit to the great edifice of evolution, which, of course, foundation stone was laid by Darwin. And it's great to be able to stand back and see the way it all fits together. I was once asked some years ago to apply for the chair of zoology at Bristol. And I went down, and I actually rather misread the occasion. I hadn't realized that this was a serious interview. I just breezed in, looking as if I'd been dragged off the street, as usual, and faced this rather glum-looking bunch of academics. And the chairman of the panel, who I won't name, said to me brightly, "How would you characterize your knowledge of biology, Mr. Jones?" And I said, "Oh, it's very broad." And he was pleased by that. But then I said, "It's fantastically shallow." and I didn't get the job. But actually, that's the beauty of being an evolutionary biologist. There is really no fact in biology which you cannot fit in to this enormous edifice which is called the theory of evolution. And there's sometimes advantages of being shallow, and I glory in splashing around in the shallows.
Well, we're going to be returning to some of these points that Steve's just raised shortly. But so finally, Lewis.
Yes, I'll be brief. I'm a South African, and I was trained as a civil engineer. My mother really wanted me to be a plumber, but anyhow I ended up as a civil engineer. And I worked as a civil engineer, and I wasn't too unhappy with it. I was at the Building Research Institute in Pretoria. Pretoria is a place that someone once described as the largest cemetery he knew with lights, so I wasn't too mad about Pretoria. And the politics was tricky, and then I went to Israel for a year, and I worked as an engineer there. Then I got a scholarship to work at Imperial on soil mechanics. Now, I want to tell you, I was in Soho in the 50s. You're all too bloody young to know what that means. But it was to be a civil engineer working on soil mechanics was not very sexy. And my friends knew about this, and one of them was getting married in South Africa and had to get out the house, and he went to the local library, and he found an article there where Swan and Mitchison, two biologists in Edinburgh, were looking at the mechanics of cytokinesis, how the cell, divides into two. And he said, "Lewis, this is what you must work on." And that's what I did. I managed to get a scholarship from the Nuffield who wanted people to change from the physical to the biological sciences and so forth. I started working on sea urchin eggs and I fell in love with cells. And once I started working on eggs, that's what I worked on in order to look at the mechanics of cleavage. In fact, I still think I'm right. In fact, I was in the library today looking up papers to show that my PhD from 47 years ago is still correct. That's another story, as you well know. And then while working on sea urchin eggs, I learned about embryos. Now, I'm sorry, it still amazes me, and should you come from one single cell. You don't look like it. One single cell, the fertilized egg. It's absolutely amazing. I also fell in love with cells. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but evolution is absolutely based on development in multicellular organisms. It's how development changes that brings about evolutionary change. And I think cells are wonderful. And somebody once said, what is it? You work on pattern formation and form. What is it that fascinates you? I said, it's maybe because my nose is too big and some of my genitals are a bit small and I want to understand this.
Okay, thank you guys. So we have our first question from the audience, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce the name. Juan Morello? Yes. So please, a microphone at the front.
Thank you very much. My question is evolution a universal force? Can whatever we learn from nature be applied to the universe, social sciences, the brain, engineering, and everything else?
So, is evolution a universal force? Can whatever we learn from nature be applied to the universe, social sciences, engineering, the brain, other areas? Let's go for Lewis Wolpert.
Yes, I would say no. I think the essence of biological evolution, but I'm not an expert in this, the essence of biological evolution is you have to have something that replicates. Now, it's only have something that replicates and changes, then you could have what I would call biological evolution. So the other story, the sort of thing, the evolution of businesses or evolution of culture or the evolution of mountains, that's not evolution in the biological sense, and one shouldn't try and apply it. You've got to have a replication and carrying on from one generation to the next, which changes, and then selection.
But Lewis, some people say perhaps universes evolve in some way. If a universe spawns...
But it's not even... Well, would you say mountains evolve, but it's not evolution in the biological sense? That's just silly. And sorry, when one comes to the idea of some of the social science nonsense, about it should also be put aside.
Steve Jones.
Yes, I kind of agree. It's worth remembering that Darwin in The Origin never uses the word evolution at all. And he only uses the word evolved once, and it's the very last word in The Origin of Species. The word evolution in his day literally meant unfolding in rather the embryonic sense. So there is a danger of just misusing the word. There's also a danger of using it as a universal alibi for everything you don't understand. And as Lewis said, that's a real problem with the social sciences, where everything which we see in human society, you can generate an evolutionary hypothesis, which is often perfectly plausible, but is not testable. I used to play a game with students called the ABC of sociobiology, where I made up various human attributes in alphabetical order and asked them to make an evolutionary explanation. How did it start? The first one was acne, spots on your face. Well, that's obvious, because what happens is males become sexually active at a time before they have enough economic power to bring up children, okay? So they get spots on their face and nobody fancies them. So that's an evolutionary explanation. The next one is blushing, okay? And what was blushing? Blushing was... a silent message of sexual acceptance by females, okay? The next one was crime, and crime was showing I'm a real man by going and beating up the man next door. And it ended up with zoophilia, which are those of you who live in departments of computer science, is having sex with animals, all right? Well, that actually comes from the origin of agriculture. The first shepherds who had sex with their sheep, the sheep enjoyed it, you see, so they stayed around, and those shepherds had more human offspring. Now, these are all great theories, right? And I'm willing to bet that I could probably get them published in some sociobiological journal, but they're untestable. And I think what I find very bizarre about a lot of evolutionary biology as applied to humans, which is in the literature, is it wouldn't get in the literature if it was about fruit flies, but it gets in because it's about humans. It's what I call arts faculty science, you know, great ideas, no tests. And I do think that there's a danger of overusing the idea.
Do you think, however, that the idea of memetics is one step too far?
No, I mean, I think you should ask the originator of that idea, that question.
Well, perhaps I should. Richard Dawkins.
Well, I share my colleague's skepticism about the over-application of evolutionary ideas. There's a very good essay by Peter Medawer about Herbert Spencer. In fact, it's his Herbert Spencer lecture, because Herbert Spencer was extremely keen on reading evolution into absolutely everything. Mountains most certainly do not evolve. Mountains develop, and it's very important to make the distinction between development and evolution. Mountains develop because one mountain simply changes. There's not a population of mountains where some of them become more numerous and others become less numerous. There is one mountain and it changes. That's development, not evolution. However, having rejected mountains as something that evolved, it is at least worth considering the possibility that there might be other things that evolve, that truly evolve in the same sense as living organisms do. For one thing, if we speculate in a science fiction manner about life elsewhere in the universe, and presumably most of us think there is life elsewhere in the universe, I think it's a pretty good bet that life, wherever it may be found anywhere in the universe, if we ever do find it, will be found to evolve, and probably by something like Darwinian means. So in that sense, I think it is universal. What else might be? Well, computer viruses, I suppose, might be said to evolve, and certainly you could set up a model system in which you were something like Tom Ray's Tierra, which is a sort of disciplined computer virus world. So clearly there are other things that it doesn't actually have to be based on DNA in order to evolve. And maybe it could be that human culture, that something like viruses do spread from brain to brain, from mind to mind, by imitation in the broad sense. And actually, that's almost got to be true. And given that that is true, then it is at least worth talking about whether something like Darwinian evolution, something like Darwinian selection might be taking place. Certain ideas, certain mind viruses might be more likely to spread than others for something like a selective advantage reason. So I think it's one of those questions that's worth discussing. I don't think one should automatically dismiss it out of hand, but like my colleagues, I think that a lot of people are all too ready to jump to the conclusion that there is something Darwinian wherever you look. And I prefer not to do that.
Okay, our next question from the audience is from Chris Clack, who is over there.
Good evening. This is another simple question. Does the panel believe that the Darwinian theory of evolution may one day be replaced by a more sophisticated theory, just as Newtonian physics was replaced by quantum physics? And is it feasible to conjecture which areas of current research might lead to such a new theory?
Steve Jones.
Well, I mean, of course, we can't deny that possibility. I mean, it's the nature of any science. We all know that very famously physics was declared finished in 1905, about 3 months before physics actually started. So I don't think one can really ever say that. I once embarked upon the rather foolish pastime of rewriting or trying to update Darwin's Origin of Species as if it were being written today. And the idea was to take the Darwinian hypothesis and the structure of the book in the same order of chapters and use modern evidence. And I was really genuinely astounded by how well Darwin's argument held up. He called the whole book one long argument. And it was a bit like, you know, my book was a kind of a postmodernist Darwin, in that he'd built the structure, put it on the foundations, and put up the steel frame, and I just bolted stuff onto it. It just stood up remarkably well. His failure, of course, which he understood, was a failure to understand inheritance, genetics, and he never got that right. So if we accept that, it's remarkable how well it's stayed unchanged in its general structure. Now, of course, there are enormous changes in detail. Darwin was a structuralist kind of biologist. He talked about increase and decreases. He talked about barnacles a lot. Darwin's barnacles are just behind there. He spent 8 years collecting barnacles. He wrote 4 the arguably most boring books in biological science about barnacles. And he was very interested in how the structure of these barnacles changed. And he got it right in a general sense. But what he didn't realize is that an awful lot of change in evolution isn't about bones being added and taken away, or segments of barnacle being added or taken away. It's about genes being turned on to a greater or lesser extent, and developmental biology having subtle shifts which have to do with gene control rather than gene presence and absence. And that has changed the way we look at the genome, really. And I think that's one way it has changed. But I don't think it's not like quantum physics, which really changed everything and made everything that went before in a deep sense wrong. I don't think it's like that, but of course maybe tomorrow I'll make the discovery that proves Darwin wrong. I certainly hope so.
Richard Dawkins.
Well, I agree with every word that Steve Jones has just said. I would add one further thing, which is that if you try to isolate the one absolutely fundamental contribution that Darwin made, I think, and I agree with him that lots and lots of details have already changed and will change, but it's astonishing how much Darwin got right. But the one fundamental thing that Darwin contributed was the explanation. It's the only explanation that has ever been suggested that works in the whole history of ideas, the explanation for adaptation, the explanation for why living organisms don't just evolve, but evolve in the direction of improvement, evolve in the direction of producing prodigies of good engineering design, and bad engineering design too, but the sort of thing that any engineer would immediately say, that is clearly designed to perform a certain purpose. Darwin explained that. Lamarck, you could say, made an attempt at explaining it, but I don't think the Lamarckian theory even could work, even if the facts supported it. I'm pretty skeptical that any other theory will ever be suggested that explains adaptation. Details will change. For example, the role of how new genetic variation as candidate for selection is produced. That's already changing and will probably continue to change. Embryology is a very complicated process, and the way mutations give rise to phenotypes is filtered through the complexity of embryology in ways that Darwin knew nothing about. And that will very likely change, and it may become a more complicated version of Darwinism. But I should be very surprised if anybody ever comes up with an alternative to natural selection, specifically as an explanation for adaptation, the illusion of good design. I'd be delighted and thrilled and excited if anybody did come up with any alternative, but I would be very surprised.
Lewis Wolpert.
I have nothing to add. I entirely agree. I don't believe for a second that anyone will come up with such a thing. I'm sorry, Darwinian, the theory works extremely well. Yes, there are details. For example, in developmental biology, we have all these RNA molecules now that are doing all sorts of things that nobody ever predicted that they did, but that doesn't change the fundamental principle.
Okay, our next question from the audience is from well, I guess it has to be from a girl, and you'll find out why in a minute. Ana Isabel Espacia Alcazar. A microphone at the front here, please.
Hi. My question is there a real evolutionary advantage derived from the existence of males? And why two sexes is the most common configuration over other possible ones?
So is there a real evolutionary advantage derived from the existence of males? Lewis Wolpert.
Speaking as an honorary male, Lewis.
Well, I'll speak about this first because I'm the one who knows least about it, and they'll tell me how wrong I am. But the article that impressed me most about the advantages of two sexes, particularly in relation to vertebrates and mammals, is one of the problems in evolution is to get rid of dud genes. Okay? You really want to lose those genes which are not helping you. And if females choose the males, and in most vertebrates, it's the females that do the choosing as to which male they're going to mate with. And this is regarded as the way of getting rid of those males with dud genes. And I like this very much, and it worries me tremendously that we may be entering a society where it's the men that choose the females, because then it's downhill all the way. But the experts are here, but that was an article in Nature.
Richard Dawkins.
This is really Steve Jones's subject, and so I think all I'll do is try to do a sort of schoolmasterly thing and explain why one might even ask such a question. I mean, what lies behind the skepticism that males might be necessary. Remember that we're not talking group selection here. We're not saying what good are males to the species or the society or the group or anything like that. Now, one question would be, why do we have sex at all from an evolutionary point of view? And this has been regarded as something of a mystery, because if the purpose of life in a Darwinian world is to maximize the propagation of one's selfish genes, then the best thing to do would be to clone oneself. And so there is a paradox in mixing half one's genes with a sexual partner. The paradox disappears if the sexual partner does exactly the same amount of economic work as oneself. So if you have mating between so-called isogamous partners who have equal-sized gametes and which are sort of halfway between egg and sperm, and so you need two of them in order to make a full-sized zygote, then the supposed advantage of cloning yourself disappears, because when you mate with another individual, you get the economic opportunity to have twice as many offspring, and so it balances out. The reason why that may not be true in the case of males is that economically speaking, males don't, or frequently don't, pull their weight. They don't pull their weight economically with respect to the size of a sperm relative to an egg, and sometimes, very frequently in fact, they don't pull their weight in other respects as well. From which it follows that if you take a species where females do all the work, all the economic work of bringing up children, then there really does seem to be, on the face of it, an evolutionary pressure for females to clone themselves, go it alone, and dispense with the male sex altogether. That clearly hasn't happened, and it's, I think, one of the active areas of discussion and argument, at which point I shall stop.
Steve Jones.
Well, as I'm sure you know, it's an enormous question. In fact, it's the question which is at the center of genetics. It asks, why do we have a science called genetics, which in general depends on sex. When I start my first year lecture course in genetics, we start in the same way. I say, I'm a geneticist, and my job is to make sex boring. And all the students look at me in amazement, and after 40 lectures they agree I do it very, very well. But in fact, that question, why males, is several different questions, as Richard hinted. First of all, why sex? Why not just clone yourself? And we don't know. One quite common answer is that by sex, you're reshuffling life's cards. And maybe every generation you're getting a new mixture of genes, okay, by recombination as it's called. And if somebody gets a bad hand of cards, they're going to die, okay, or at least not pass on their genes. And by that death, you're not just losing one bad card, you're losing 10 bad cards. Somebody else might get a good hand of cards, and they will survive, and that life will preserve a whole new mixture of good genes. So that's one of several theories, the origin of sex. So that's sex, but why sexes? Why do males and females, why are they different? And why only two sexes? I mean, the definition of a sex is somebody being of a different sex from you is you can mate with them, okay? Well, there's only two sexes here. I mean, how boring can you get, for God's sake? Some little single-celled creatures have got 100 sexes, so they can mate with 99% of the people who they meet. If only that were true for humans, right? There are only two sexes, and we have some idea why, but okay, we've got two sexes. But why so many males? You only need one, okay? I mean, you have to give me some time, but, they're all this size. But one of the reasons there is that the rare sex, and this was pointed out, this is one of the early triumphs of mathematical biology, this was, and I can tell you there have been very few triumphs of mathematical biology. R.A. Fisher, who I'm sure most of you will have heard of, he realized that if you've got two sexes, males and females, and one male could impregnate 1,000 females, but of course then it becomes very, very advantageous to be male, so that every male, however crummy he is going to survive. So males become more common. And you'll end up with this fantastically tightly balanced sex ratio, which is exactly 0.500 in humans at the age of 16. It changes before that and after that, but at the beginning of sexual maturity, it's exactly 0.5. So we understand that, but most of the rest of sex, apart from you computer scientists, of course, is a complete mystery.
Thanks. Our next question is from Colin Johnson, who is on the left here.
Thank you. There are a number of constraints on natural evolution. For example, there are physical constraints, chemical constraints, logical constraints, and historical constraints. We might want to add to that list computational or information processing constraints. Are these constraints important in evolution, in particular this computational constraint, and has the balance of them changed over evolutionary history?
Richard Dawkins.
Gosh, that's a question that I've never met before. A computational constraint. I'm not sure I can even imagine what that might be.
Well, Colin, would you like to stand
up? I mean,
I'm
genuinely fascinated, but I think we need to get a bit of a seminar going here to see what a computational constraint might be.
Well, Colin, stand up again and explain further.
So, for example, the ability of some part of an organism to compute something or to process information about its environment, might these things contribute to fitness in the same way that physics contributes to the fitness of the structure of our bodies? So
oh, well, if you mean that computation in the literal sense of what a brain does, then clearly there's a sense in which at least those species that have big brains use them for computation, and presumably it's useful that they do. And when you ask what they compute, well, I imagine they're computing the optimum behavior, the optimum strategy to adopt in a particular environmental situation. And that can get very complicated indeed, and the computational demands could be very formidable. I hadn't realized that's what you meant, and I think that's got to be true in some cases. And in a way, the question then becomes, well, why are so many organisms still around that don't have computational equipment like we do? Maybe we get a sort of computer-centric view because we happen to have big brains, and other mammals do to a lesser extent as well. But I think that there may be a sense in which the whole genome of a species, which, as Steve has just told us, is a constantly reshuffled data pool, the whole genome of a species could in some sense be said to be doing something a bit like computation. And we could look at it this way. You could say, because natural selection of past generations, natural selection of ancestors, has winnowed out and favored those genes that in combination with each other program the development of bodies that survive in past environments, the genes of a species could be thought of as a database of information about ancestral environments. And I could imagine reconstructing the environment in which the ancestors of a species lived by a sufficiently sophisticated computer examining the genes which are being reshuffled in the gene pool of that species. So if you looked at, say, the gene pool of the species of a species of mole, you would find in a sense a description of the underground world of the ancestors of those moles. If you looked at the genes of a herring, you would find a description of life in the surface layers of the sea. So I do think there might be, in addition to the obvious sense in which nervous systems are evolved computers for computing things about the environment in short time, during the lifetime of the individual, from moment to moment, from minute to minute, from second to second. There's also a sense in which in evolutionary time, the gene pool, the changing gene pool of a species, is a shifting database which could almost be said to be making computations about the optimum way to survive in the environment of that species.
So, Lewis.
I just want to point out, I don't know whether I have a different concept of constraints. The development of the embryo strongly constrains what it can evolve into. In other words, if I gave you some mice and said you can have 500 years or 5,000 years, you're not allowed to look at the genome, but you can do as much selection as you like. Do you think you could ever get them to evolve wings which were feathered? And the answer is no, because there just have to be too many. So this is what I mean, developmental constraints. The way the embryo develops at a particular time constrains how the embryo can evolve. And I can give you many more examples.
Steve Jones.
I think there's one computational constraint in the more precise sense, which is about the nature of the code which all creatures are built on. I mean, computers, as I understand it in my ignorant way, are largely built on binary codes. Of course, as we all know, life is a remarkably simple and remarkably consistent coding system. There are four, generally speaking, four bases, works in triplets and make 20 amino acids, which are shared by the whole of life, with the exception of many bacteria and archaea. Now, that's an extraordinarily simple computer system. I mean, why haven't we come up with an 8-base system, say, with 500 amino acids? And it's very hard to know, but the standard response is to go back and say, well, actually, most of these constraints are historical constraints. As indeed Lewis's example of mice, of feathers growing on mice, is a historical constraint. That's why pigs can't fly. Pigs can't fly because they descend from ancestors without wings, okay? It's as simple as that. Now, it may well be that the very first life system to get going was simple, had a 4-base computing system. It got going, and once it got going, there was no room for anybody else. And we're stuck with it. Now, if we could set up a system with a better computer base, it might do better. And we might be able to do that. Craig Venter, who's that, I bet I hadn't libel him here, that unusual a molecular biologist in the States, is talking about doing this, making new kinds of creature with new kinds of genetic code. It's an interesting and risky thing to do, but it will be to escape from these computational constraints you've talked about.
Richard.
Could I just reply to Lewis when he says that you absolutely couldn't breed wings with feathers from a mouse? You didn't give yourself enough time. Because think about it like this, or at least answer me why you couldn't do this. Since mice and birds have a common ancestor, theoretically, couldn't you just simply work your way back to the common ancestor and then work your way forward again and evolve feathers that way? It would take a hell of a long time.
I think Lewis is too old to do that.
Yes, I'm not very keen on doing that. And it's not just the feathers, it's getting wings on the back.
No, but the point is, no matter what you do, since every living creature has a common ancestor with every other one, why can't you go back to the fork?
Lewis will know, of course, what the French for mouse is. Okay, the French for bat. A bat is. It's chauve-souris. A chauve-souris literally means a shaved mouse. And of course, apart from a few details, bats and mice are the same. There's no difference between them. They're mammals. They're quite closely related. One of them flies. Okay, it doesn't do it in the same way as birds do, but it flies. So if you said, can you make me a mouse that flies, I would be not surprised if you could make a mouse that flies. But it wouldn't have feathered wings. It would do it in a different way, because evolution is very pragmatic. It builds on what it's got. So give me the grunt and I'll give you the flying mouse.
No, I'm terribly sorry. You might take... But I do remember having this discussion with the physicist once. And I said it would take too long. He said, but you can take time and everything is possible given time. I said, is it possible that you could wake up tomorrow morning as a platypus? He said, it's a very small chance, but it could happen. I said, I think we've ended the conversation.
That does end the conversation. That does end the conversation. But neither of my colleagues has answered my point. What is wrong with going back to the common ancestor? I think there is something wrong, but you haven't answered it.
But I don't know what it means to go back. Here's a mouse. How do I go back?
You select for a pre-mouse, a mouse that's a little bit less like a mouse, a little bit further back towards a lizard. I mean, not a lizard, but you know what I mean. I mean, a common ancestor of a mammal and a bird.
I don't think it would help you one iota.
Well, you haven't thought it through then, Lewis.
Well, I think I have, because all I see is you're going back, and so what? Then you're going to come forward again. You still don't know how many genes you've got to change in order to get wings on the back.
All I'm saying is that there is a trajectory. We know that there's a trajectory because we know that there's a family tree. Now, I think you possibly couldn't do it because I think there may be irreversible mutations which have supervened in the forward direction, so you probably couldn't actually go backwards. But nevertheless, I think that's the right answer to my riddle.
Let's move on to the next question. The next questioner is Michael Schmidt.
Hi. As computer scientists and engineers, we often build up complex systems gradually. We build a small part, and then we use that again and reuse that to build a larger part. We call this kind of a modular design, so we can build more and more complex things hierarchically. And so I was curious, since this debate is about complexity and evolution, to what extent does nature exploit the idea of reusing evolved parts and building up more and more complex structures in that sense?
Steve Jones.
So the question really is, to what extent does nature use evolved parts for new functions? And I would say absolutely 100% all the time. Richard has written very eloquently about the eye, for example. There are, I've forgotten the exact number, I'm sure he'll remind us, at least 10 totally different ways to construct a highly functional eye. Flight, you've got birds, which have got whole arms to make wings. You've got bats, which use a hand. You had pterosaurs, which are giant flying lizards, which are an example in the museum here, which had one giant finger that came out. You've got flying squirrels. You've got ants with flattened heads that can glide for hundreds of meters. You've got snakes, which are flattened in their bodies and can glide from the tops of trees for scores of meters. You've got squid that come out and soar over the surface of the sea. Not the earth, thank God. And every every single one of those is an example of the adaptation called flight emerging on a totally different bow plan, body plan. And every single, at the biochemical level, you have many other examples of the same thing. So, I often think that evolution, if there was a designer out there, which there ain't, he or she would lose their job, because evolution is a tinkerer. It never thinks forward, it only looks backwards. It can't think forward. It has no sense of the future, the distant future. So I think it's absolutely the fundament of all evolutionary change is that it tinkers. There's a famous paper by Jacob and Monod, which is actually called Evolution as a Tinkerer. It's an old paper now. And they really make that case. So if that's also true in computer science, that you're constantly building on less successful programs that went on before, you are doing Darwinian evolution.
Lewis Wolpert. No? Richard Dawkins.
I agree with everything that Steve said, but I think he missed half the question, so I want to do the other half, and I agree totally with that half. I think the questioner also had in mind the idea of modularity, and the idea that in a computer program you have discrete modules like subroutines and procedures and things which are not just used again, but distributed around. And that, of course, life also does hugely. I mean, the cell is a module which is cloned trillions of times, and essentially the same organization is to be found all over the body, modified in various ways. At higher levels, organisms like lobsters and centipedes and millipedes and indeed vertebrates too are modular on a segmental body plan, where they have, you think of a millipede as being like a train with trucks going all the way down from front to back. Those are modules, and then slightly more modified arthropods like lobsters, crayfish, shrimps and things also have the same idea of a longitudinal array of modules of segments, but each segment is different from the others. There are huge savings to be made in manufacturing anything by building it in a modular way, and life exploits this all the time, just as Steve said, it also reuses things again and again.
It's just worth, one small point is just worth pointing out that some of the complexity comes from duplication of certain regions of DNA. So now you have several copies of the same region, which then can evolve in their own peculiar way, and that can lead to further complexity. And part of your body plan, where your head is and where your ribs are and so forth, are determined by genes that have duplicated in that way.
Okay. Do we have a Kester Clegg in the audience? Yes, we do, right at the back. Kester, your question.
Okay, thanks. Nothing in evolutionary theory seems to tell us why we haven't remained as primordial slime at the bottom of a river or a lake somewhere. After all, bacteria are quite good competitors. Could it be the case that complexity is irrelevant to evolution? It doesn't penalize it, and it doesn't care how complex something is. Anything goes as long as you can reproduce.
Is complexity irrelevant, Richard Dawkins?
Well, there's a certain truth in there that the majority of creatures that are alive today are bacteria, and clearly there's a very good living to be made as a bacterium. And there are lots and lots of creatures that are less complicated than others. And so complexity certainly is not a kind of driving ambition for all evolutionary lineages, far from it. However, I think the way to look at it is to say that when the easy ways of making a living have all been used up by bacteria, by plants, whatever it might be, then there are still ways to make a living which build upon those easy ways. So if there are plants, then there's a living to be made eating plants. And that may involve a certain increase in complexity. You have to move around, you have to find the plants, you have to digest them and so on. And then, given that there are animals that make a living eating plants, then there's a living to be made eating the animals that eat the plants. And that might involve somewhat more complexity. You've got to find your prey, you've got to chase it, you've got to subdue it. Then you get arms races developing, arms races between predators and prey. Similarly, arms races between parasites and hosts. You get an escalation of complexity because the problem of discovering, of finding your food, or the problem of avoiding being food, is the problem of outwitting, outpacing, outrunning, outgunning an evolving lineage which is evolving in the direction of trying to do you down, trying to make life harder for you. So if you're a predator, you're engaged in an arms race with prey, and life gets harder because the other side of the arms race is itself evolving. Conversely, from the prey's point of view, the predators are themselves evolving. And so you get an escalation of techniques which are increasingly complicated, complex. So I think that although the questioner is sort of fundamentally right, that there are plenty of good livings to be made not being very complex, then you do get a kind of superstructure of making a living on the backs of the simpler ones, and arms races make them even more complicated. Having said that, I must stress, of course, bacteria are actually very, very complicated by the standards of anything we can understand.
Can I just ask, I'd like to understand what people mean by complexity. Is there a measure for complexity? I slightly worry. This is your subject, Peter.
Well, this has actually been quite a common question that they wanted to ask you guys. How do we measure complexity?
Well, I must say I'm very suspicious about complexity in embryos. Is it just more of the same thing? Can I just remind you that flies say to each other, "Isn't it amazing how similar the development of humans is to our development?" All right, you may say flies are not so... I mean, we may go on longer, our development, but that it's more complex, I'm very suspicious of. Most of the signals between cells are much the same. The mechanisms within the cells are the same. There's just more of it. And if you want to regard that as complexity, okay, but I think it's giving a sort of fancy name to something which is simply bigger and therefore of no great relevance to evolution whatsoever.
But Lewis, is it not true that, I mean, from the computer scientists in the audience, they would be thinking of layers of complexity? I guess there's no other word for it.
No, I don't believe there are layers of complexity.
But think of a gene regulatory network, and then gene regulatory network, and then a cell-to-cell signaling network, and
Sorry, when one comes to embryos, cells are more complicated than embryos. The signaling between cells in embryos is trivial compared to what goes on inside a cell. And I don't believe that what goes on inside your cells is very much that much difference than that which goes on inside, I don't know, any fish cell or any hydra or anything else. Yes, there may be a few more interactions if you have more genes, but the idea that it's somehow a different level of organization, I'm sorry, I don't believe it. But maybe there's evidence in the audience, somebody's waving his arm saying that he says he does know.
Well, let's get a microphone here. Okay, on your left. There you go.
If you had a bigger fly, it would be conscious, would it?
Sorry?
If you had a bigger fly, would it be conscious?
No, I don't think so. If the fly had a bigger brain, it could be, yes. Depends on how big it is. But that's, sorry, we're talking about two different things. The behavior can be very much more complex. I'm talking about the developmental process. I thought that's what we were talking about. The sort of the ultimate behavior, and I think that's the thing. There's no question that the complexity of the behavior of humans compared to other animals is much more complex. I would accept that. But the actual mechanisms that give rise to that are in principle identical.
Okay, I think Steve might want to say something.
I think we're being a bit less generous to biology than we might be by saying we don't measure complexity. I mean, I'm part of the time an ecologist, and I spend a lot of time trying to measure, and many other ecologists have too, trying to measure species diversity. and the complexity of ecosystems. And there's a lot of argument about it, but a very simple thing is to use the Shannon index and just ask, you pick up one plant species, what's the next one? Is it the same as the previous one, or is it different? And that's rather a crude index, but you can find big differences in complexity. I was actually doing just that this afternoon. And on a grazed pasture in southern England, you've got tremendous species diversity, which you can quantify and compare with other regions, whereas in a beechwood in southern England, with its all beech trees, you've got much less diversity. Talking about the brain as we have been, there's a lot of stuff being done very recently looking at the rate of change in brain genes in humans versus chimps, mice, and even further down. And the odd thing is they change slower than genes in the liver, much slower, incidentally, than genes in the testis. If you look at the human and the chimp brain, they have the same number of genes, as far as we can see, which are active at the same rate. The only difference is that in the human brain, and the evidence is not that great, but the only difference is there's more connectedness. And what you can use is use models of information flow through the internet, for example, to look at the degree of connectivity in the brain, which is higher in us than in chimps. So I think we do try and measure complexity, but how successful we are, I don't know. Certainly there's no drive towards complexity. The reason that Darwin, I would never use the word hated for Darwin, because Darwin was an extraordinarily gentle man. But the reason that Darwin disliked Lamarck deeply was that Lamarck had, I've forgotten what the phrase he used was, the law of necessary progress, that there was a drive to get better and better, that to get more and more complicated. This was part of the law of evolution. But this isn't true. Look at tapeworms. They're beautifully adapted, but they're much simpler than their wild-living relatives. So I don't think there's any necessary increase in complexity, but we do in biology try to use complexity measures. Whether we do them rightly, I have no idea.
But do you believe, like Lewis, that, well, perhaps I shouldn't paraphrase Lewis, but it almost sounded as though you were saying we're no more complex than a bacteria?
No, sorry. I was saying that the developmental program is no more complex. The end result is much more complex. Sorry, I didn't make that clear, and thanks for correcting me.
Could I rise to the challenge of defining complexity? I follow Steve in using an information theory definition as he does for ecology. You can do the same thing for the morphological structure of an animal. I think it was my old professor John Pringle who suggested this. The complexity of an animal, or indeed of anything else, is the information content of a description of it. So to use my earlier example of a millipede and a lobster, they're both segmental animals with a linear array of segments going down the body. If you want to write a book describing a millipede, what you would do is describe one segment and then say, and repeat. Whereas if you wanted to write a book describing a lobster, you couldn't do that. You'd have a separate chapter for every segment. Now, of course, it depends how much detail you go down to. If your millipede book goes down to the cellular level, whereas the lobster book only stops at the gross anatomy level, then it would be the other way around. But if both your books go down to the same level of detail, then the book about the millipede is going to be a much shorter book than the book about the lobster. So it is, and you could express it in numbers of bits of information if you wished. It's a measure of the information content of a description of the object.
Okay, well, we have the next question which relates to this in some way, and this is from Ken Stanley.
How is it possible for 30,000 human genes to encode the connectivity of a 100 trillion connection brain? And how is it possible for evolution to search a space of such astronomical complexity to discover such a structure?
So how can 30,000 human genes encode the connectivity of a 100 trillion connection brain? Steve James.
Well, takes a deep breath. I think, gene is a four-letter word. It's an old joke. And it's become much more of a four-letter word in the last few weeks when we've discovered that an awful lot of what determines what genes do lies in what was laughably described as junk DNA. And it may well be that, in fact, there's a mass more information there than we ever thought, than in those naive days of 6 months ago when we simply looked at protein coding segments as being the genes. Okay, the genes are the bricks. The architects may lie in the junk DNA. So it may be much more information than 30,000 genes, but it's still perhaps a relatively small amount of information. But I certainly can't sell myself as an expert in information theory, but I'm sure you can set up iterative rules of information with less than 30,000 parts in the rule, which will generate fantastically complicated things. I mean, you can make Mandelbrot sets, say, which are very complicated things, with a very simple iteration. So I don't necessarily think that particular one is a problem, but I might just be speaking, as I so often do, from deep ignorance.
Lewis Wolpert.
Well, we don't know how the brain is constructed, and we don't know whether every neuron in the brain has its own individuality. But with 20,000 genes, each cell in the brain could have its own identity. How it would actually be specified during development, I can't remember how come on, you're mathematicians, you know. If I've got 20,000 genes, how many different combinations, can I specify? It's billions.
Richard Dawkins.
Yes. I mean, the answer lies in embryology, which is a very complicated process in which things emerge. It's a sort of bootstrapping. I used to do some machine code programming years ago for the then Apple Macintosh. It's probably changed now, but in those days, if you looked at a Macintosh program, what you would see would be a whole lot of calls of the same subroutines. It wouldn't matter whether the program was a word processor or a spreadsheet or whatever it was. What you would see would be the same names cropping up over and over again, which would be machine code subroutines in the so-called toolbox, which was part of the ROM or part of the system that you loaded up first. So I think of these 20,000 genes as being like the toolbox in the ROM of a computer. They're the repertoire of available subroutines that any program is going to use. And all the cleverness comes in the order in which you call those subroutines, the permutations in which they're put together, the emerging properties, switching to embryology now, the emerging properties that arise from the calls of those fundamental subroutines. So I think it's...
Sorry about this.
Thank you, Steve.
Go away. It's my wife. And she won't shut up. Go away, damn it. Right.
Okay, I think I've said my say now.
Saved by the bell. Okay, so we have a question that perhaps presents a slightly different viewpoint to this from Keith Downing. Oh, he seems to be walking up behind the dinosaur, right.
Since the embryo's environment, where environment includes the womb, is now known to play a huge role in genetic expression and development, is the strict disproof of Lamarckianism merely an artifact of the old interpretation of DNA as the single significant determinant of the phenotype?
So this is questioning the role of the environment and...
But sorry, just let's get... As I understand Lamarck, is that the idea is that some environmental influence could be carried from one generation to the next. And that's just nonsense, because that it has to get into the genome. And the fact that the environment can affect how the embryo develops, well, of course it can, but that's got nothing to do with the inheritance from one generation to the next. The environment doesn't change, or there may be... Epigenetics has got a sort of fancy title at the moment and that sort of thing, but I wouldn't take it too seriously. And Lamarckism, there's just no evidence whatsoever that something that happens during, if I learn to ride a bicycle, it will not be genetically determined.
Steve?
I mean, let's bear in mind, first of all, that Darwin was a Lamarckist in that sense. I mean, Darwin believed in the inheritance of acquired characters, and he was wrong. But there is, some quite fairly remarkable findings. I mean, if you look at human obesity, which, as we all know, is in the Western world and the developed world is a major medical problem, it's now quite clear that if you have either a very overweight mother or indeed a very underweight mother, and the underweight mother's discovery came first, in the Dutch famine of 1946, at the end of the Second World War, many women were very, very underweight when they were pregnant. So their children grew up to be underweight because they had a rotten time when they were embryos. Their children grew up to be underweight. And their children are still now growing up to be underweight, a bit less underweight. So this kind of phenomenon can stretch over 2, 3, or 4 generations. And there is a deeper DNA imprinting effect, which can maybe stretch over a few more. But when we're talking evolution, let's bear in mind we're generally talking thousands, millions, or billions of generations. So I think in the large sense, I don't think that we've, the interesting recent stuff about environmental transmission from generation to generation, which is very interesting indeed, but I don't think, it's mud between Darwin's toes. It doesn't mean that he's got feet of clay.
Richard.
Yes, I agree with that. There may be, you have to remember that there's more to Lamarckism than just the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And it may be that there are some acquired characteristics which under rare conditions can sort of find their way into the next generation and the next. And it'll kind of fizzle out after, as Steve says, after a number of generations. But the really important thing about Lamarckism is that it was a theory of how you could get adaptive evolution. So it went with the idea that the animal strives for something, and then it went with the idea, the law of use and disuse. The more you use a bit of yourself, the bigger that bit grows, the famous blacksmith's arms or the giraffe's neck getting stretched. And then the idea was that that got inherited, and so that accounted for the evolution of the long giraffe's neck or the evolution of any adaptation. You explain an adaptation by saying the ancestors of this animal worked hard, strove for something. The bits of the body that were used for that thing consequently got bigger. The increased size of those bits of the body got somehow imprinted into the genome, and then they were there for the rest of history. Well, that certainly doesn't happen. And I don't actually believe that even if it did, it would adequately account for the phenomenon of adaptation. So I think it's probably that Steve is right, that there are some interesting new findings that suggest a kind of inheritance of acquired characteristics in rare conditions. But it's very misleading to go from that and say we have a revival of the Lamarckian theory of evolution.
Okay, so our next question is from Matthew Hyde.
Thank you. What are the selection pressures that drive human evolution today?
Well, if I'll barge in and come up with my usual shallow answer here. I think today is the crucial thing. We can certainly look at human populations across the globe and see selection pressures that drove us very recently. One you may know about is the ability or otherwise to digest milk. And it turns out that in large parts of the world, adults cannot digest cow's milk. And that makes sense. Why should an adult want to digest milk? Because before agriculture, you would never get milk as an adult. And it turns out that the ability to digest milk exactly overlaps the early domestication of cattle. And the effect is strong. There are more people who cannot digest milk in England. Let me get it right. Yes, there are more people who cannot digest milk in England than there are in Scotland. Okay. And in Africa, there are many, many people who can't. In China and Japan, they can't do it at all because they don't have a history of dairy industry. So that's recent. Okay. But the question is today. And the interesting thing is you can actually make a fairly confident statement that almost nothing is acting on natural selection in humans today, because natural selection turns on differences in the ability to survive and differences in the number of offspring you have, and that's what it is. And if there are no differences, there is no natural selection. And generally in the developed world there are no differences. A British or American or a Japanese child born today has a 99% chance and more of lasting to be 21. In Shakespeare's time, it had a 33% chance, okay? And lots of those differences had those deaths had a genetic component. Nowadays, almost everybody has got 0, 1, 2, sometimes 3 children. Go back into history, you get people like Mulai Ismail the Cruel of Morocco, who had 888 recorded children, okay? So his genes were doing pretty damn well. So there are no differences. There's a thing called the index of selection opportunity which you can measure, and it's collapsed. We're all the same, so there isn't any.
Do you
for the
agree?
time being.
Richard?
Sorry, can I ask Steve, what about resistance to certain nasty infections like bird flu and issues? Sorry.
Well, I mean, yes, sure. You can. I should add a caveat to that. That if I was giving this talk in Africa, obviously there are enormous differences in survival with HIV.
Well, I was going to suggest that too, exactly.
And they have a strong genetic component. There are big differences in the ability to survive HIV that depends on genes. But here, people with HIV, thank goodness, are enabled to survive pretty well with drug therapy. So those genes become irrelevant, more or less.
But what about bird flu?
Well, what about bird flu? I think, I often say if you're worried what utopia is going to be like, you shouldn't be worried because you're living in it now, all right? Something's going to come out and get us. It might be bird flu, it might be some new kind of Black Death, and some of us are going to resist that genetically and some of us are not. So, enjoy yourself. It's later than you think, I think is the answer.
Richard Dawkins.
We have to remember that it's not just survival, it's also reproduction. I dare say a fair number of us in the room here today owe our existence to the fact that our parents may have been incompetent in the use of contraception. If there's any genetic component to either general incompetence or specific incompetence in the use of contraception, then by definition we do have natural selection in favor of incompetence. I don't think that's a very realistic example, but I just tell it as a way of reminding us that it's not just survival. Steve is absolutely right that it's pretty hard in the developed world to die young. It's pretty hard to die before you reach reproductive age. But there is huge variance in the number of children that people have, and we would need to be satisfied that there is no genetic variance there in order to say that there's no selection. On the other hand, even if there is genetic variance in the number of children you have, or for example, to use my facetious example, in your competence at using contraception, even if there is genetic variance in that, it doesn't seem likely that the same selection pressures as are working today will last for very long, because to pursue my facetious example again, whatever it takes to be incompetent in using today's contraceptives may be very different from what it takes to be incompetent in using the contraceptives of just 1 century, or indeed less than that time.
Do we have a response? We have a response from the audience here.
It seems to me, at least in the United States at least, that the number of children people have varies a lot with religion. And I think, Richard, you speculated that perhaps spiritual belief could be genetically influenced. And it also seems that, it's so extreme in some cases. Many religious families have 6, 7, 10 children, and many atheist families have 1, 2, that could have a significant effect.
Are we going to be outbred by religious people?
Well, I know how politically sensitive that kind of question is. I was traveling with a man the other day who took that possibility very seriously indeed. He was an American who very strongly believed that our kind of people, as he put it, ought to be having more children. And he was setting a good example by having 5 baby boys, all under the age of 3, triplets and twins. It is, speaking demographically, one can make forecasts about the religious complexion of parts of Europe in the next few decades, which have me very scared indeed.
Do you want to respond?
Yes, I think that's right. There's a statistic I'm sure you all know called the demographic transition, which is the balance, the shift from high birth rate and high death rate to the Western pattern of low birth and low death rate. And that has happened at astonishing speed all over the world in the last 15 years, nearly all over the world. In India, for example, much of India is going through it at unprecedented speed. China, partly with some state pressure, has gone through it very quickly. The one exception, the two exceptions actually, one is in sub-Saharan Africa, but there you've got a high birth rate and a high death rate, and the other overwhelmingly is in the Middle East, where you've got a very high birth rate and a low death rate because they've got pretty good medical care. So that is an issue. I don't know. I see the spread of religion. I mean, let's not talk about religion because it's so boring. But the spread of religion is much more a social thing than any element of biology. You know, let's remember that in the days of Catholic Europe, there were huge classes of non-reproductive individuals, monks and nuns, okay, who actually were segregated and put aside not to have children. So religions don't necessarily multiply themselves. I mean, some of them, there were one group. Who were they? Their first rule was to have no children. Who were they? The Shakers, that's right. And they didn't last very long.
Okay, well, we are rapidly running out of time, which means we have to move to our final question, which is from our conference chair, Hod Lipson.
I'd like to ask a question not unrelated to the previous question. And I think that many people joining our field or considering joining, making a career in the field of evolutionary computation have on their mind. And that is that mainstream computer science and engineering often finds it difficult to believe that bottom-up self-organizational processes like evolution can outperform top-down, intelligently designed algorithms and products. And I was wondering, although most of the people in our field are not against evolution, I was wondering if these feelings are rooted in the same kind of feelings that cause objection to evolution in general, and if so, what can we do about it?
Richard Dawkins.
I think that's a very interesting question. Clearly, bottom-up design works because evolution undoubtedly does work and it does explain the whole of life. One can indeed express some surprise at that because on the face of it, anybody who's familiar with human engineering will feel that it's much more likely that it would have come about by a top-down designer. I think that there are some interesting shortcomings to bottom-up design. It does tend to get driven up blind alleys, and it's hard to escape from those blind alleys in the way that a top-down design would be able to. The top-down system is capable of throwing away a line of unprofitable development and just starting again with a clean sheet on the drawing board with a completely new idea. That doesn't happen in evolution. In evolution, you have to go step by step from something that went before. So you can't, for example, do the equivalent of throwing away the propeller engine and designing a jet engine from scratch. The equivalent would be to evolve a jet engine step by step, screw by screw, rivet by rivet, from a propeller engine. There is a sort of going back to the drawing board, which Steve alluded to, I think, earlier, in this sort of going back to something that has nothing to do with it. It's called pre-adaptation sometimes. You run out of evolutionary steam in a particular way of say, making a wing. And so you go back to an earlier stage and you make a wing in a completely different way. So that's kind of a slight escape from the problem that I raised about bottom-up design. But as I look over the animal and plant kingdoms, the thing that surprises me and fills me with admiration is just how powerful bottom-up design actually has proved to be.
Lewis Wolpert.
Well, the problem with design and evolution, and it's something we've not touched on, is that when you get small changes, it's not difficult to see, for example, that wings developed, they were a great advantage. But when they were very tiny, did they really have an advantage at all? And it's, I mean, Darwin was very thinking, in other words, the adaptive advantage of intermediary forms, which I think presents a major, major problem in many evolutionary issues. You know, in other words, it's a very small adaptation. Is it an advantage? So bottom-up is fine, but you've got to find adaptation for the small steps that take you where something really is an advantage. For example, the development of lungs. All right, it's something in the fish's mouth which also brings in oxygen. Does that really, I mean, are there really fish that want to leap out of the water or get a little bit more oxygen? It's that just a little adaptive advantage. Does that really give enough advantage to make it selective?
Lewis, you're sounding like a creationist.
It's funny that you should mention that. In the dark of the night, I really feel how much easier it would make life.
But, I mean, Lewis, you're asking a very old evolutionary question, which,
of course it is. Darwin understood
which Richard answered in a characteristically succinct way, which is, what use is part of an eye? Well, the answer is a whole lot more use than no eye at all. And you can see all these intermediary steps remarkably well. And in many cases, not in all cases, but in many of, if you look for them, you tend to find them. If you don't look, you won't find them. And that's the problem with the argument from intelligent design, which is it's the argument from ignorance, it's the argument from arrogance, it's the argument from incuriosity. This is very complicated, I can't understand this, I am very clever, therefore there must be a designer out there. It's, you know, it's pathetic, it's creationism with a college education, I often think of it, you know, it's there's nothing to it, it's so empty, it's laughable. I have a lecture I've given once or twice, which is called Why Intelligent Design is for Stupid People. And it brings in huge audiences. And they all get very angry, and I don't persuade anybody. But it does strike me as entirely vacuous, I have to say.
Okay. Well, on that note, I'm afraid we are out of time. So I apologize for all of those who had questions and didn't get an opportunity to ask them. And can I ask you once again to thank our three speakers, Richard Dawkins, Lewis Wolpert, and Steve Jones. Thank you very much.
Can't be done now again.